Hey there, Navandis here, welcome to another Path of Exile guide, this time with the General's Cry Shield Crush, a build which despite all the changes and nerfs in 3.15 actually turned out very strong on a low budget and very beginner friendly. Now, as usual, I'm rating this build on 5 different categories: defense and survivability, single target damage and bossing, mapping and clearing speed, cost and viability as a league starter. Now do keep in mind this is my personal rating system, there's no international standard here or scientific method to it. I'm just using previous builds I've played as a frame of reference, which will obviously vary and differ for you, so take these with a grain of salt or just use them as a rough guideline. That being said, even though we went with a Berserker as the Ascendancy class, which isn't exactly the poster child for defensiveness, we do end up pretty tanky by stacking several defensive layers. So you should easily end up with at least 6k life, a metric ton of armor and physical damage reduction, excellent life leech and life gain on hit, as well as other means of recovering life such as consuming corpses and pairing that with Kitava's teachings or whenever you Warcry. Add to that stun immunity, a decent chance to block, and the overall very defensive playstyle, because you don't actually have to hit enemies or you don't have to actually be anywhere near combat. Now this defensive playstyle, coupled with the amazing sustain that doesn't depend on Flasks and coupled with the massive amounts of DPS you can get, leads to very easy and smooth bossing. Your only concern will be dodging the boss moves and not standing in fire, and your Mirage Warriors will constantly deal damage to the boss, so you'll have a pretty decent DPS uptime. Now when it comes to mapping, you're not a ranger, so you won't exactly clear entire screens in a split second. However, with 5 or 6 Mirage Warriors attacking from different angles and the overlapping waves of Shield Crush, you end up with very decent clearing. Now all this can be achieved on a pretty low budget, the most expensive item being the 6-link body armor, which is the case with pretty much any other build out there. Apart from that, the cluster jewels, which are easily craftable, and maybe the shield, but that has a very wide range which can go from 1C to, I don't know, a couple of X. Now if you do have the currency and wanna spend more on this, the build has a pretty high ceiling when it comes to gearing, so you can always invest some more currency, but you'll also get proportional performance out of it. Now this low budget aspect, coupled with the fact that you don't actually need any mandatory uniques, even the best in slot recommended ones are very common 1C uniques, makes it a great league starter. The only thing you need is a shield with as much armor or evasion as you can get, and that should be fairly easy while going through a campaign. Just grab any rare one, or you can even craft them by using an alchemy orb or a few alteration orbs. Now before I go into the finer details on how the build works, how to gear up for it, what gems you'll be using and so on, if you have any questions or any doubts after you've watched the guide, feel free to drop by my stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/navandis. You'll find the schedule in the pinned comment and video description. Okay, so let's see how does this thing work anyway. There are two main components, General's Cry and Shield Crush. General's Cry is a war cry which will spawn Mirage Warriors from nearby corpses, and those warriors will use whatever attack is linked with the war cry. In this case they will use Shield Crush. Each of them will use the skill once, then disappear, then you Warcry again, and you repeat the process. So they will target nearby enemies and even charge them from quite afar, and because each warrior only attacks once, attack speed is irrelevant, and this in turn allows us to stack more of other damage mods such as crit chance, crit multiplier or flat physical damage. Another thing you need to keep in mind is that Mirage Warriors are not minions, they don't scale with minion damage, they are not affected by minion mods in any way. But they're also completely invulnerable to any damage and they cannot be targeted by enemies. Now when they attack, they actually inherit your own damage stats, so pretty much like totems do. For example, if you had 50% chance to crit, your Mirage Warriors will each have 50% chance to crit as well. Now, I said earlier that General's Cry is a war cry, and war cries are a special category of abilities in Path of Exile. They're not spells, they're not attacks, they are not auras, they're basically war cries. And that means Warcries have their own specific mods that affected stuff like Warcry speed, Warcry cooldown recovery, or Warcry power. Now for this build we don't care about Warcry speed, which is kinda the equivalent of cast speed for spells, and that is because we are taking the keystone Call to Arms, which will make your Warcry instant. For cooldown recovery we get enough from the passive tree, so you can cast it pretty much every 2 seconds, which is just enough for the warriors to charge their target and attack once. But if we were to reduce the cooldown even further, then that wouldn't give enough time to your warriors to fire off their attack. Finally, Warcry power is a thing you should at least know about in theory. There's nothing you actually need to do in practice for this build about Warcry power. The effect of a Warcry generally scales with its power, which is calculated by counting the number of mobs in its area of effect. So white mobs grant 1 power, magic 2 power, rares 10, and unique or bosses grant 20 power. However, General's Cry also counts corpses, so if for example you have 10 corpses nearby, that would be another 10 power. This Warcry needs 5 power for each Mirage Warrior, and by default at max gem level you can spawn 5 of them, so you need 25 power. So let's say you are fighting a boss that's 20 power, and having 5 corpses around it would be 25 power, which would be enough to spawn the 5 Mirage Warriors. Okay, so now where do you get the corpses? Well, the build uses a simple casual channeling setup, Cyclone plus casual channeling and Desecrate. You just spin around with Cyclone and Desecrate will automatically be casted and generate the corpses. Now you don't actually need to hit or kill anything for that to happen. You can just spin around in one place and you'll get the corpses. And since General's Cry is an instant cast, you don't actually have to stop spinning at any point and you can spam the Warcry while cycloning. Now let's talk a bit about the other component of the build, Shield Crash, which is the ability that actually deals the damage. Shield Crash hits enemies in a wide cone-shaped area with 3 waves that overlap, and each enemy can be hit by up to 2 of these waves, and bosses, because they have a very large hitbox, pretty much always get hit by 2 waves. Now Shield Crash's damage is based solely on your offhand item, and it gains a very strong damage bonus for each 15 armor or evasion that offhand item has, which basically means we need to use a shield. There's literally no weapon in the game that would provide a higher damage bonus. On top of that, your main hand weapons, damage, attack speed, critical strike chance are all meaningless to Shield Crash, so for this reason we'll use some sort of stat stick in our main hand, which is something that provides some global bonuses or some sort of beneficial effect. The perfect weapon for that is the Darkseer, an item which has pretty much always been very cheap, hopefully it will stay the same way, and it provides quite a few amazing bonuses. We get global physical damage, we get a high chance of blinding nearby enemies, which reduces their chance to hit us by 50%, and enemies we blind while we ourselves are blinded have Malediction. Malediction means targets with this debuff will take 10% more damage while at the same time they deal 10% less damage. On top of that, the Darkseer also provides a very good flat life bonus, which is a stat that is not normally found on weapons. So now all that's left is to find a way to blind ourselves so we can apply Malediction, and that is easily done using a Timeless Jewel, Brutal Restraint, with a flavor text in the Akara of Nasima. Socketing that jewel in your passive tree will convert any keystone in its radius into Second Sight, which will blind you and provide a massive critical strike chance bonus. On top of that, it will also add various other bonuses to small passives and notable passives in its radius, which can actually be pretty strong. So to sort of wrap it all up, you spin around using Cyclone and generate corpses, you spam General's Cry, which uses those corpses and creates Mirage Warriors, which will immediately attack nearby targets and charge them and hit them with Shield Crash. Shield Crash's damage is based off your shield, so that's about it, you just rinse and repeat that. So that's pretty much all you need to know about playing the build. I'll now go over how you put it together, so the passive tree, the Ascendancy, the gems, the gear, and all that kind of stuff. So with the build overview out of the way, let's see how you go about leveling it, the passive tree and a few leveling uniques as well as the cluster jewels. So you start off as a Marauder, and even though you do get Shield Crash at level 1, it's not really that strong early on, because most of the shields you can get at that stage are hot garbage. Apart from unique shields, the rare ones you might find while leveling are pretty much shit. So you also don't have access to General's Cry until level 24, which means your clearing speed will not be amazing either. So instead, for the first 30 levels or so, I actually recommend leveling up using Smite and an Ancestral Protector totem setup, which will help you with the early bosses. You will find the leveling setups in the POB in the skills tab, so make sure to check those out. Now, if this is not the first character of the league for you and you can buy some leveling uniques, then I do recommend buying a Red Blade banner as the shield, 2 Praxis rings to take care of all your mana issues, and maybe a classic gold ring for a massive amount of resistances. A great early weapon is the Princess Sword, and you can replace that at level 32 with literally your best in slot endgame weapon, the Darkseer Scepter. Then add the classic Wanderlust boots, maybe a Carnage Heart, a pair of the Great Old One Tentacles gloves, and maybe a Tabula Rasa. Now with Tabula, I don't recommend going more than 4 or 5 links early on, because if you go with a full 6 link, the mana cost will skyrocket and it will be very hard to sustain. And speaking of mana, early on, if you have issues with that, make sure to grab 1 or 2 enduring mana flasks, and don't reserve more than half of your mana pool with auras. You only do that in endgame once you've taken care of your mana issues. Finally, here's the passive tree and the order you take the notable passives. As always, in the tree tab of the POB, you'll find the passive tree broken down by act and level brackets, so make sure to check that out as well. Now, one last thing about the passive tree, I did mention earlier in the build overview section that we're using a Timeless Jewel, a Brutal Restraint Timeless Jewel, which converts any keystone in its radius into second sight. So we place that right below the Constitution wheel in that jewel socket, and it transforms Eternal Youth into second sight. Now, obviously, don't take Eternal Youth keystone before it's converted, before you actually socket the Brutal Restraint jewel in the passive tree. Now, 3.16 introduces a new system to the passive tree called Passive Masteries. Any passive cluster or wheel that has a notable passive in it will also have an associated passive mastery. And you can see that by clicking on the icon in the middle of the one such wheel. Now, passive masteries are basically a list of bonuses that are related to that particular mechanic or archetype. So for example, the Admonisher, which is a Warcry, has a Warcry mastery associated with it. And Warcry mastery bonuses are obviously related to Warcries. You can spend a point on the passive mastery and select one of the available bonuses, and in this build we're actually taking quite a few of those. Now, Natural Authority is also a Warcry passive cluster, so it has the Warcry mastery associated with it. And you can spend a point there as well and pick one of the mastery bonuses, however, you cannot select the same bonus as you did with the Admonisher. Now, the build does use cluster jewels, and for the large one you're looking for Martial Prowess and Feed the Fury as your main passives. The third one is a bit more flexible. You can go with Devastator, Riot Queller, Precise Retaliation, Prodigious Defense, or Gladiator's Fortitude. Either of these will be fine. For medium cluster jewels, the lineup is pretty simple. Momentality for basically free endurance, frenzy, and power charges. You have a chance to gain those every time you Warcry, which is basically always. Haunting Shot for a massive damage bonus by intimidating enemies. Intimidated enemies take more attack damage. Warning Call, which adds about 6,000, 7,000 armor, which is pretty damn nice for defense. And Cry Wolf, which will ensure you have enough power for your Warcry, enough Warcry power to generate 6 Mirage Warriors, to summon 6 Mirage Warriors when you have the Helmet Enchant, which gives you +1 Mirage Warrior. Now, if you don't yet have the Helmet Enchant, you can replace Cry Wolf with Provocator. We're also using a single small cluster jewel, which is the unique Kitava's Teachings. This will consume a corpse every second and will heal you for 5% of your maximum life. And since we are generating corpses with Desecrate, we're constantly creating corpses, you will constantly have this healing up as well. As always, you can find the trade links for the cluster jewels in the POB in the Notes tab. With the passives out of the way, let's quickly go over the Pantheon choices. As I say always in my guides, Pantheon choices are situational and there isn't a best pair that will outperform all others in every scenario, so you should swap them for certain boss fights as needed. Now, I can provide the baseline, which is, the set of powers that you should be using most of the time. So for the Major God, Soul of the Brine King becomes an almost instant pick in 3.16 and onwards, thanks to freeze immunity and reduced effect of chill bonuses. When upgraded, this Pantheon power alone should be enough to justify no longer using a Flask of Heat, which could be replaced with something more useful, like removing poisons or ignites. As for the Minor God, I'd recommend the improved Soul of Ugul for some much needed curse mitigation bonuses. In the past, it used to be much easier to get rid of curses just using a warding flask, but that's really no longer the case. So now we need to stack up reduced effect of curses, and having 30% just from this Pantheon power alone is actually a very good deal. For the Ascendancy, the Berserker is the obvious choice when it comes to war cries and attack damage, so that's obviously what I went with as well. After finishing the first labyrinth, you grab Warbringer, which is basically the linchpin passive for the Ascendancy and the build as a whole. With it, whenever you warcry, you generate a certain amount of rage based on the warcry power if you had less than 25 rage. So with Crywolf, a few corpses and a boss, you'll go from 0 to 60 rage just using General's Cry once. In turn, rage massively boosts your attack damage, movement speed and attack speed. The second part of this passive says if you had more than 25 rage when you warcried, it will sacrifice 10 rage to empower exerted attacks and have them deal 50% more damage for the next 4 seconds. Without diving too deep into the whole exerted attacks thing, I'll just say that any attack that is used with General's Cry, in this case Shield Crush, is considered exerted, so will benefit from that bonus. So putting it all together, this passive will help you generate a massive amount of rage and empower your Shield Crush to deal a lot more damage just by warcrying something you're doing at all times anyway. The next Ascendancy passive you'll pick up is Crave the Slaughter, which will further help with generating rage every time you hit an enemy and raise the rage cap from the default 50 to 60. Now, unfortunately, Mirage Warriors hitting enemies with Shield Crush will not generate rage this way because they're not considered you. They're a separate entity that hits, it's not you that's doing the hitting. However, Cyclone is more than enough to top off your rage even in boss fights, even when fighting a single target. You follow this up with Rite of Ruin, a passive which will triple the effect of rage, and it will grant stun immunity if you have at least 25 rage, which should be basically permanent. However, it does come with the downside of losing some life per second depending on how much rage you have. Still, this isn't such a big issue since you're offsetting that with a Vitality Aura, with Life Leech from your Cyclone and Feed the Fury passive, maybe some life gain on hit on rings, and the recovery you get from Kitava's teaching, Consuming Corpses, and the Escalation passive. Now, rage is incredibly important beyond its inherent bonuses when you factor in the Berserk ability. This will constantly consume your rage and provide a massive damage bonus buff while at the same time reduce the damage you take. Now, in most fights, if you keep spamming your warcry, you should be able to sustain a Berserk for 7 to 10 seconds. And then the skill goes on a 5 seconds cooldown, during which you will regenerate your rage and then you repeat the whole process. Finally, the last passive, Aspect of Carnage, is a true Berserker ability. It basically boils down what this Ascendancy is all about. It provides a massive damage bonus while at the same time you take 10% more damage yourself. The trade-off is totally worth it though, and you're tanky enough so you won't really feel the difference, and at no point will you feel like you're a glass cannon. At the same time, the damage bonus will shorten any fight significantly, which, you know, will provide less opportunities for you to make mistakes and die. And with that, let's move on to probably the most important aspect of any build, gems and links. Now, the numbers you'll see listed here represent the gem level and gem quality, and sometimes for certain gems I might list the gem at a lower level than 20 and the quality might be 0. This is because in certain scenarios we do want to keep gems at a lower level, or quality might be useless for that gem for this particular build. So they're not typos, they're meant to be at different levels. Now, also for the 6 link setup, I'm listing the gems in order of their importance, the support gems. So if you can only afford a 5 link, if you can just get a 5 link, just drop the last gem in the setup. Now, with that out of the way, let's start with the main setup, General's Cry plus Shield Crush, and the supports here are melee physical damage, brutality, impale and pulverize. Now, there's nothing really out of the ordinary with these supports here, probably just brutality, which will have your Shield Crush only deal physical damage. So let's say if you had a ring with adds 10 to 14 fire damage to attacks, that mod would be useless. It's a wasted mod. So yeah, don't get items like that. A really important thing here, getting a level 21 General's Cry and Shield Crush gem will actually be a massive damage increase. You can do that through corruption using a Valorb, and one of the possible outcomes using that on a level 20 gem, and one of the possible outcomes is for the gem level to increase by 1. And you should do that on a 20 quality gem as well. You should get the quality up to 20 first, because after corrupting you cannot do that anymore. Now, an Empower gem at level 4 is actually stronger than Pulverize, however it also usually costs a few Exalted Orbs, so only upgrade to that if and when you can afford it. Drop Pulverize and replace it with Empower level 4. Empower level 4 upgrades the levels, increases the levels of active skill gems linked with it, so in this case General's Cry and Shield Crush. Once Shield Crush reaches level 22, the bonus it gets for every 15 armor on the shield goes from 4 to 6 physical damage to 5 to 7 physical damage, which might not seem like a big difference. However, when your shield can have up to 3000 armor or even more than that, well, that gets multiplied by 200 plus, so it is a huge deal, it is a big difference, and it does translate into a gigantic damage increase. Extra levels beyond that level 22 will even further increase the base shield crush damage, and that is one of the best ways to scale the overall damage output of this build. However, do keep in mind an Empower level 3 is worse than Pulverize, so only an Empower level 4 would actually be an upgrade over Pulverize. The next setup is the corpse generating machine made out of Cyclone plus cast while channeling, Desecrate and Fortify. As mentioned in the build overview section, you spin around with Cyclone and it triggers Desecrate to automatically create the corpses you need for General's Cry and Kitava's teachings. You don't actually need to hit anything or kill anything to generate the corpses, so you can stay away from combat if needed. However, if you do hit a target, you will also get the Fortify buff, which reduces the incoming damage from hits. You will also generate rage if you hit targets, which can fuel the Berserk ability I talked about in the Ascendancy section, which further reduces the damage you take as well as increasing your own damage. So you can choose to stay away from the fight if needed and if you wish to. However, if you do go all in, if you decide to jump into the fight, then you will have the defensive advantages, the defensive bonuses to back it up, right? Then we have a Val Ancestral Warchief totem setup linked with multiple totems, Maim and Culling Strike. When you plop down these totems, they provide a massive damage bonus. They also maim targets, slowing them down and having them take increased physical damage from any source, so including Shield Crush. And if an enemy is at or below 10%, they will instantly kill that enemy thanks to Culling Strike. And yes, that applies to bosses as well, so you can instantly kill Cirrus or Shaper if they're at or below 10%. We also have an aura setup made out of Pride, which increases the physical damage enemies take while in its radius. Precision, buffing your crit chance, and accuracy, both very valuable for this build. Now do keep in mind, Precision, unlike most auras, doesn't reserve a percentage of your mana pool, but rather a flat amount which increases with the gem level. And for this reason we want to keep it at about level 12 to 15, depending on how large your mana pool is. Then we have Dread Banner, which buffs your chance to impale. It increases the impale effect and also reduces the enemy's accuracy, so it reduces their chance to hit you. Finally, there's Blood and Sand, which is an aura that has two modes, Blood and Sand, and you can toggle between them by casting the aura again. However, for this build we only want to keep it in Blood stance to increase our damage. Sand stance is pretty much useless. We're left with the sockets in our weapon and shield, and the first setup is a custom damage taken at level 4 and an Immortal Call at level 6. Now, custom damage taken, as the name implies it, will trigger the linked spell, in this case Immortal Call, when a certain amount of damage is taken. However, the higher the gem level, the more damage is required for the trigger, so we want to keep it at a relatively low level so it gets triggered as often as possible. Then we add a Vitality Aura at level 8. Now this obviously isn't triggered by the custom damage setup, this is an aura. And similarly to Precision, it doesn't reserve a percentage of your mana pool, but a flat amount. So we keep it at level 8 simply because we cannot afford to level it up much higher than that. And finally, the last setup is Leap Slam plus faster attacks, which is your mobility setup. Faster attacks will have Leap Slam be much more responsive and quicker, and this is especially important when used defensively, for example in boss fights. And finally, we have Berserk, which again I talked about in the Ascendancy section, so you can check that out if you skipped it. Basically, this is your Super Saiyan button, which increases the damage you deal massively and reduces the damage you take while consuming rage. So make sure you use this skill basically on cooldown, or at the very least in every boss fight or tougher encounter. Now, as usual for each gear slot, I will generally list 3 tiers, basic, mid tier and best in slot. The price and performance generally increases with each tier, obviously. Now, if the differences are not that big between 2 tiers, I'll probably just combine them. Also keep in mind, in the POB, in the notes tab, I've included trade links for each gear piece, and you can use those to more easily find and buy the gear you need. Now, I do recommend expanding the filters on the PoE trade for each link, so you can see and tweak them according to your character and budget at the time. So starting from the top, a basic tier helmet should be a rare one with some life, resistances, maybe some accuracy or chaos res or both. If you can get those on a pure armor base, that would be ideal. On mid tier, there are 2 different choices. You can go with Crown of the Inward Eye or with Abyssus. Now, I would recommend the Crown to most people. It's the most balanced choice. It provides you a shit ton of armor and life, some DPS, decent DPS actually, and even some flat mana, which will in turn allow you to reserve more with vitality and precision to level up those auras some more. On the other hand, Abyssus is basically like the Berserker Ascendancy condensed into a single item. It will give you a ridiculous amount of damage through the flat physical damage bonus and the critical strike multiplier. However, it will have you take more physical damage yourself. No matter what you're doing, don't go over 41 or 42% increased physical damage taken for that mod, because when you pair that with Aspect of Carnage, it might be too much. So overall, I generally recommend for most people to go with the Crown, with Crown of the Inward Eye, Abyssus only if you feel like you are pretty tanky or you're more experienced. Finally, for best in slot, it's either of these 2 helmets, but with the enchant, General's Cry has +1 to maximum number of Mirage Warriors. Nothing comes even close to the amount of damage you get from an extra Mirage Warrior. Now, luckily, these 2 helmet bases are some of the most popular for enchants for lab runners, so you should be able to find a few of them even quite early in a league. Next, we have the weapon, which, as I said in the build overview section, is basically a stat stick for this build. In the off chance you cannot get the recommended best in slot one, or maybe in the first day of or 2 of the new league, then go with either the unique Tempestus Steel or with the Scava with 2 red and 1 green socket. However, you should prioritize getting the best in slot, the Dark Scepter, as soon as possible, because when you pair that with a Brutal Restraint unique jewel, you get massive bonuses to your damage and defenses. Oh, and keep in mind there are 3 different variants for the scepter, for the Darkseer scepter. Just go for the one that provides +1 maximum life and +1 maximum mana per character level. The ones with energy shield are basically useless, or just use a trade link in the POB to find the right one. And now for the real weapon of the build, the shield. The top priority here is to get as much armor as possible, and the number you're concerned with is the one listed in the implicit. That is the real final value after all the mods have been calculated, all the affixes on it have been calculated. Then as a rough guideline, for basic tier you're looking at something between 1,500 to 2,000 armor. For mid tier, 2,500 is a very good spot, and this is basically what I've been using in all the footage you've seen in this guide. And close to 3,000 or over is a best in slot. That's already a very high amount of armor, and your damage will be proportionally high. On top of that, anything else you can get here is just icing on the cake. Extra life, resistances, maybe a bit of extra chance to block, life regen, life recovery on block, anything really. Next, the body armor for basic tier, a 5 or 6 link rare one with 80 plus life, 80 plus resistances, maybe on a pure armor base, should be really good and effective early on, and should be very cheap even in the first few days of a new league. Now for mid tier, you can go with the Lore Weave that has your maximum resistances are 78%, anything lower than that is pretty much junk, and as high critical strike chance and flat physical damage as you can get. Finally, for best in slot, we're once again looking for a rare body armor, but this time trade some resistances for the Warlord mod. Attacks have plus critical strike chance. Now that 1.5% roll might seem like a very low value and not worth a few extra exalted orbs. However, that gets added to your base critical strike chance and is what gets multiplied afterwards with all the sources of increased critical strike chance or more critical strike chance. So in reality it translates to 10 to 15 rather than, you know, just being a 1% increase. So totally worth it. Now if you can afford it, you can also look on top of that for +1 to level of socketed active skill gems, which will increase the level of Shield Crash and Generous Cry, and I've mentioned earlier in the guide why that is very important. However, don't expect that to be cheap, and especially since you should still look for at least some flat life, you know, 80-90 flat life on the body armor, even with those two amazing damage mods. Moving on to gloves, on basic and mid tier, you're looking for 60+, 70+ maximum life and resistances, along with some accuracy and flat physical damage. A base like spiked gloves would be ideal if you can afford it for the extra damage implicit. Now on best in slot, you're looking for exactly the same affixes but on a Sinistral gloves base. This will increase the damage with offhand and decrease the damage with main hand. Now I've said a couple of times throughout the guide that Shield Crash's damage only takes into account your offhand, your shield in this case, so we don't care about the downside of reducing our damage with the main hand. Basically these gloves were made for builds like this. Now if you have enough resistances to be capped without the gloves, you can go with the unique Great Old One Tentacles, which will greatly boost your clearing speed. They're pretty common and you can even find some with a corrupted implicit plus critical strike chance. Next up, boots, maximum life, 25 to 30 movement speed and as much resistance as you can get. That's the lineup for the basic and mid tier boots. You can get over 100 resistance easily on a pair of two-toned boots. However, on best in slot, nothing will beat the Stampede. Now normally when you cyclone around, your movement speed will be drastically reduced. However, with these boots, your movement speed will be 50%. No more, no less. This will be your cruise speed after you put these moldy shoes on. On the other hand, Quicksilver Flasks and stuff like Onslaught or the extra movement speed provided by Rage will no longer apply either. So your movement speed will be 50%. Again, no more, no less. However, there's another huge bonus these boots provide. You can actually anoint them similarly to how you can anoint an amulet using oils dropped from blight encounters to add a notable passive to them without changing the item in any way. So you can add any notable passive from the passive tree as an enchant on these boots. So if your chance to hit is not yet capped, then Depth Perception is one of the best and cheapest options you have available. Otherwise you can anoint Assassination for more DPS. If you're looking for more survivability, then either Deflection or Discipline and Training are probably your best bets. Moving on to your belt, similar to gloves, this is a slot where you want to stack up as much life and resistances as possible, including even some chaos resistance. For basic tier, going with the Rustic Sash base is ideal for the physical damage implicit and of course maximum life and resistances. On mid tier, you're looking for pretty much the same affixes but on a Stygian Vice belt with the extra Abyssal socket implicit, which is better than pretty much any other implicit you could get. Even an average jewel will still be much better than any other implicit. And for best in slot, the unique Rizlatha's coil is pretty much unbeatable for physical damage builds. What this belt does is widen your damage rolls. So if you normally roll between 50 to 100 damage, with this belt you will roll between 25 and 125 physical damage. Now the key here is to look for Rizlathas with the lowest possible roll for the less minimum physical damage and the highest possible roll for the more maximum physical damage. That's about it for the belt. Next is the amulet. Here by far the most important mod you're looking for is minus mana cost. So that would allow you to spam your abilities without caring about mana and having only 70 to 80 mana unreserved by auras. Now there are two different mods here. Non-channeling skills have minus mana cost and this can go up to -7. And channeling skills have minus mana cost and this can go up to -3. Now between rings and amulet you want 3 of these mods. 2 for non-channeling skills have minus mana cost and 1 for channeling. That's because Cyclone's cost ends up being about 3 or 4 mana, so only 1 channeling mod will be sufficient. And Generous Cry cost is much higher, so you need 2 of the non-channeling variety. These minus mana mods are prefixes and you can craft them using your hideout crafting bench, and you find the recipe by unveiling items dropped by Elrion, a syndicate member, if you're lucky enough, or you know, maybe you have a friend that already has the recipes unlocked, or you can just buy the items with the minus mana mods on them. They're pretty popular and a lot of builds need them, so it should be fairly easy to find items like rings and amulets that already have this affix. Apart from that, you basically try to get as much maximum life and damage affixes as possible, while still maintaining your elemental resistances capped and ideally positive chaos res. Flat physical damage, accuracy, increased critical strike chance and increased crit multiplier are the most basic and common damage affixes you can find on this slot, at least for basic and mid tier. For best in slot, add either +1 to all physical skill gems or +1 to level of all strength skill gems, which can be found on either Warlord or Hunter influenced amulets respectively. Now if you're fine walking around with a single kidney, you can sell the other and buy an amulet which has both these mods and your damage will basically skyrocket. Now do keep in mind you can anoint amulets as well. This is the gear slot where you can normally use anointing, not boots. So you can use the same recommended passives I specified for boots. Obviously, you cannot anoint the same thing you anointed on boots, they don't stack, so choose another one that you didn't anoint on your boots. For rings, the priority is still having a minus mana mod on each of them, depending on what you already have on your amulet. Now, on rings, there are fewer damage mods, fewer good damage mods, so you're basically looking for flat physical damage, accuracy, maximum life and resistances. On mid tier, you can get the same, but on a steel ring or diamond ring base for the damage implicit, or you can go with an amethyst for the buffed chaos resistance implicit. And on best in slot, you want a beefier mid-tier ring, so one with higher numeric values, and pair that with a shaper ring that has trigger assassin's mark when you hit a rare or unique enemy. This will be your curse for the build. Next are jewels, and I did cover the cluster jewels in the passive tree section, so check that out if you skipped it. Apart from that, the very important one is the unique Brutal Restraint with the flavor text in the Akara of Nasima. This one converts any keystone in its radius into second sight, which blinds you and synergizes with the Dark Seer weapon. It also adds dexterity on all the small nodes in its radius, and that might just be enough so you don't need any extra on your gear. And if you're lucky enough, you might get some very decent bonuses on the notable passives in its radius. Or, you know, you might get some shit like cast speed or minion damage, which are completely useless for this build. And last but not least, the flasks. You'll obviously need a life flask, so go with a panicked divine life flask of staunching for instant healing and bleed removal. The second flask should be an experimental diamond flask of heat, increase critical strike chance and removing freezes and chills. If you have the Stampede boots, then the third flask won't be the usual Quicksilver flask because your movement speed cannot be further increased, so instead we'll go with the Surgeon's Sulfur flask of curing. However, before getting the Stampede boots, do go with a Quicksilver flask of adrenaline. Fourth one is a Lion's Roar unique flask, provides a decent damage bonus as well as a good chunk of armor. And finally, the last one is an experimental Jade flask of reflexes for a whole bunch of evasion. Now, if you didn't yet solve your mana issues, if you still don't have the minus mana mods on your rings and amulet, then go with an Enduring Eternal mana flask. Now you can also craft these flasks using Instilling Orbs and the Hideout crafting bench to have them triggered when certain conditions are met. It's up to you which ones you choose. I generally set the flasks that remove ailments to be triggered when that ailment is present. So for example, if I have a of heat flask, then I will have them triggered when I'm frozen or chilled. Apart from that, the rest of the flasks, for example the damage boosting ones like the diamond flask, I have them triggered whenever I hit a rare or unique monster like a boss.
Learn anything new, Exile?
If you did learn anything from this guide, even if you just want to steal an idea for your own build, then my job here is done, and I would definitely not mind at all if you liked the video or wrote some fancy words, even if it's just to tell me the guide sucks. And if you subscribe, I'll name my next character after you. I won't, but I still greatly appreciate it, and it does help more than you might think. Thank you all for watching, and see ya next time.